ago now that I set off on a trip around Southeast Asia and then Australia with a plan to stay for as long as I could on a working holiday visa. For the first month, I travelled in a group starting in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, through Laos, Thailand, and finally to Bali and the Gili Islands. I was having an incredible time, visiting temples, climbing mountains, catching fish by hand, eating the local food, and trying to avoid the dreaded Bali belly. I spent my last day on Gili tea getting a dragonfly tattoo on my ribs, and eating delicious local dishes, of course. The next day I was violently ill with a stomach bug that I suspected at the time to be ink poisoning, but it was probably the prawns. I left with my friends on the short ferry over to Lombok, which I miraculously managed without vomiting on anyone. But I was too ill to go with them on the ferry the next day back to Bali. So I stayed at the hotel near Bangsal Port on Lombok. In the hours following this, I ended up severely dehydrated and could barely stand. And a lovely local man called Addy took me to the local hospital, which is a story in itself, complete with cats, a very kind local lady, and jam sandwiches. But I don't actually have time for that now. When the earthquake hit, I was back at the hotel. It was night time, and I was on video call to my mum, reassuring her that I was okay, and that I would head to my room soon to sleep it off. She told me afterwards that she heard loud banging and crashing, me swearing, and then the line went dead. I couldn't contact her for 15 hours after that. The ground felt like it was swinging, maybe a metre or so each way. Someone on the table next to me shouted to run. I did. I managed to grab my backpack and my phone and rugby tackled the floor outside as the tin roof of the hotel narrowly missed me and crashed to the ground. People were screaming, injured figures emerging from the dust. The locals were bundling themselves into their cars and driving off. I was stranded with 2 Italian tourists, one of whom had recently been studying earthquakes. As the chaos unfolded around us, we made a plan to get to open space, and then we ran. It's incredible what the body can do when you're full of adrenaline. That night was the most terrifying night of my life. At one point, someone shouted that a tsunami was coming, and I remember thinking, I'm dead. We spent the night running through rice fields and dishevelled streets amongst the destruction. By the end of the night, I was alone in a sea of locals, trying to get some sleep on a hill somewhere while the ground continued to tremble. I had left the other 2 I was with to get on a scooter to find higher ground. The driver promised that he would go back for my friends, but I don't think he did. I remember asking, is this high enough? Are we safe? With no sure reply. There were countless aftershocks that night, and during each one, the families lying around me on the dirt prayed, a dull drone of fear and hope that a tsunami wouldn't reach us. The next day, I cried tears that had been held back by sheer terror. The tsunami never came. I was happy to be alive and was comforted by the laughter of the local children. One of the locals took me back to Bangsal to look for my backpack, but the hotel was partially collapsed, so I abandoned it, and I went with him to a nearby village. Amongst the death and destruction, the local people had rallied together to create shelter, and they shared their food and cartons of water with me. The heat was unbearable, and my sickness returned. There was no running water, no toilets, and the aftershocks were still happening. That day, I borrowed a phone and I called my mum. I was alive. I don't remember what we said, but I remember the relief in the familiarity of her voice. Then followed a day and a half of finding a way off the island to Bali. With the help of distant connections on Facebook, I was picked up, eventually, from a dodgy hotel somewhere in Mataram, which is the capital of Lombok. I felt unsafe, scared, and sick. I'm incredibly privileged in so many ways in this story. I was alive and uninjured. My family back in the UK managed to find a flight from Bali to Australia just a few days after the quake. Many people were stranded for days after that. My cousin from Brisbane met me in Sydney and I fell asleep properly for the first time in days. My Aussie family took me in and supported me while I got back on my feet. My mum and my brother came over at one point to check that I was really, really okay. I had a lot of love and care around me, but I felt dark, empty, and afraid inside. What I needed was a way to find the strength to adventure again. With all the love and care in the world, I was still unable to get out of the sticky fear of anxiety that I found myself in. That was until, with the encouragement of Joey back in the UK, who is now my anchor partner and is here tonight, I went to my first munch, which, for those of you who don't know, is a social meetup of kinky people in a non-kinky setting. At the munch, I found a small community of people who I identified with in a way that I hadn't felt before. They were kinky, some of them queer, some of them in relationship setups I'd never heard of before. I met a polyamorous German guy there who was also travelling. He was a shibari rigger, and we ended up tying together, going to rope jams and kinky parties in Brisbane. I felt that sense of adventure again, but I also felt safe. I was encountering spaces where experiences were negotiated and consent was explicit rather than implied. I was choosing to relinquish the control that I had lost when the earthquake came. I was creating a safe space with others to feel vulnerable and getting the aftercare that I needed to feel held. I witnessed others in deep states of surrender, unfazed about naming their needs and desires and receiving exactly what they had asked for. It felt groundbreaking, earth-shattering. At the time, I didn't know it, but through an exploration of the kink world, I was working through my grief and my fear, learning to drop into my body, reclaiming my agency, and re-empowering myself. I had found a community who understood me and gave me the permission that I needed to be the kinky, queer human that I am today. Alongside kink, I was also learning to hula hoop, as you do. And through my kink connections, I met a travelling companion who also hula hooped and who was also kinky, and who I worked with at festivals in Eastern Australia. Dancing, hula hooping, and kink all have one thing in common. They were taking me out of my mind and into my body. Throughout the rest of my time in Australia, I sought out kinky experience, festivals, and community. I found wonderful humans, expansive love, and friendship that I still cherish today. There were many factors, but exploring kink was where I began to heal my fear, and this permeated into the rest of my experiences. Eventually, I felt strong enough to adventure alone again, and I set out on a solo journey along the East Coast before heading back to the UK later in 2019. A lot has happened since I came home. I've found my community here, kinky and otherwise, and I continue to look for expansive love and friendships and to find them in abundance. The blueprints that I found in kink for creating safe spaces for exploration, expressing boundaries, taking ownership of expressing my own needs and feelings, and exploring desires have been invaluable to me, as are the tools for exploring and breaking down the heteronormative and mononormative rules that I thought I had to live by. It's not been easy, and I continue to learn every step of the way, but I am determined to be the most authentic version of myself that I can be. Great. Most recently, I have had the pleasure to be part of a wonderful team facilitating workshops on ethical kink and play fighting and all other sorts of juiciness with Lex and Fennel, who some of you might know, and Fennel is over there.
I love you.
I love you too. where I get to witness others experiencing the transformative and often healing aspects of kink that lifted me out of a dark place. I feel that I am right where I want to be, co-creating the experiences for others that have meant so much for me. Sometimes we need something big to shake us out of our shells, and we need something transformative to create something new. For me, that transformation started with kink. I've realised in the years that followed that kink has been a gateway to healing in so many ways, not just from the aftermath of the earthquake, but also from years of making myself small and ignoring my desires. I learned to embrace my identity, my authenticity, and my power. It's now my ambition to help others to do the same. Thank you.